Hi there, students. Today we're going to talk about deep ecology, but before we do that, I want to spend a little bit of time reviewing what we covered last time. The last lecture was over ecocentrism. What is ecocentrism? Ecocentrism is the view that biotic communities or ecosystems are directly morally considerable, and moreover, that they're the fundamental bearers of inherent value. So it's not just that biotic communities or ecosystems are directly morally considerable, but that they're the fundamental, in a way, the most important thing. What's the land ethic? Remember we read a piece by Aldo Leopold. He's advancing the land ethic. And the land ethic, you'll remember, says that an agent's act is morally permissible if and only if it preserves the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. Why should we accept that view? Why should we accept ecocentrism or the land ethic? Leopold gives us a couple reasons. So one, you might think we should accept it because we're obligated to preserve our communities. So he thinks that's true on like the human level, and he thinks, well, humans are actually part of this larger community, right? The biotic community. So if we think we got an obligation to preserve our human communities, we've also got an obligation to preserve the biotic communities we're a part of as well. Another reason to be attracted to this view is because it explains our intuitions about particular cases. So, for example, the elephant management dilemma. What are we going to do? Should we kill elephants to protect the ecosystem? And if you think we should, it seems like a strike against an animal rights style view. So, ecocentrism gets us the result we want, maybe, assuming we want that result, right? That it's permissible to kill elephants. Why I think we should reject ecocentrism? I talked about one example right at the end last time, but the book talks about several, and I want to just review those briefly. First, ecocentrism can't explain what's wrong with causing animal suffering. So if you think it's wrong to cause animals to suffer, ecocentrism is not really going to be able to explain that, especially just sort of one animal in one particular case. Two, ecocentrism implies that the interests of wild animals matter more than the interests of domestic animals. Again, if you're attracted to an animal rights style view, you're going to say, well, the interests of wild animals matter, but the interests of domestic animals matter too, and so they're sort of on a par. But the ecocentrists seems like they've got to give some privileging to wild animals because those wild animals are more important to the biotic communities. Number three, ecocentrism implies that the interests of rare species matter more than the interests of abundant species. Potentially strange, right? So why think that rare species matter any more than the interests of species that are abundant? Of course, you might not think that that's strange at all, right? Maybe that seems exactly right. And if that seems right, maybe you're attracted to ecocentrism. There are two last criticisms, and these are in a way kind of the most interesting ones, I think. So it seems like ecocentrism would justify the mass murder of invasive species in the name of ecological stability. So this is called the ecofascism objection. The thought is like everything is sacrificed in the name of the ecosystems, and even if that's like a large population of some invasive species. 5, it also seems like ecocentrism countenances the killing of humans in the name of ecological stability. So this is called like the misanthropic objection. The thought here is, right, that we should be killing humans because that would be good for the environment. Okay, so that's ecocentrism. And today we're going to talk about deep ecology. Deep ecology is a holist view, kind of like ecocentrism. And so let's talk a little bit about what this view is. Unlike some of the theories we've looked at before, deep ecology is an entire worldview that has certain metaphysical, ethical, and epistemological commitments that come with it. What does that mean? So you remember the chart that we've looked at a few times this semester, right? So when we think about what philosophy is, there's sort of these three main branches, and one of those is metaphysics, ethics, and epistemology. In our class, we've been primarily looking at ethics, and in particular, sort of normative questions about what theories are correct, and we've also looked at some applied ethics questions about what we should do about particular kinds of scenarios. Now, one way to think about deep ecology, right, and maybe the way we'll focus on, is being a theory about moral considerability or moral status. It's actually a theory that kind of combines some elements of biocentrism and ecocentrism into one. But the point that I was just making on the previous slide is that there are certain metaphysical commitments behind why deep ecology has the value theory that it does. It's also got some epistemological commitments that explain why it holds the views that it does. We'll talk a little bit about those. That being said, we're primarily interested in deep ecology as a theory of moral status or moral considerability. So for our purposes, we're going to say that deep ecology is a version of biocentric pluralism. And Sandler talks a bit about this in the book. What's biocentric pluralism? Biocentric pluralism is a view on which all of the living organisms are directly morally considerable, and a view on which both individuals and collectives count as valuable. Deep ecology, right, is biocentric because deep ecology is committed to the view that all organisms are directly morally considerable. And deep ecology is pluralistic because it's committed both to individualism, that the individuals are morally considerable, and holism, the view that collectives, such as species or ecosystems, can have value that goes above and beyond, over and above the values of the individuals that make those things up. Sandler also talks about how it's a kind of biocentric egalitarianism, and that's just to say that all living organisms are equally considerable. The book also talks about the 8 principles of deep ecology, and I'm going to just read through these. I think it's worth sort of saying a little bit of something about them. So 1. The well-being and flourishing of human and non-human life on Earth have value in themselves. In other words, they have inherent worth, they have intrinsic value, they have inherent value. These values are independent of the usefulness of the non-human world for human purposes. What they're saying here, right, is that humans aren't the only thing that's valuable. All life on Earth is valuable, even if it's not useful for humans. Number 2, richness and diversity of life forms contribute to the realization of these values and are also values in themselves. Here they're saying that diversity is valuable independently of sort of its usefulness to humans or its usefulness to other things, but there's just something good about having diverse life forms. Number 3, humans have no right to reduce this richness and diversity except to satisfy vital needs. So here it makes a bit of a slight concession to humans, right? That humans can reduce the richness and diversity if they need it to satisfy their vital needs. But otherwise, humans can't do it, right? So not for fun, not because it'd be cool, not because it would be really nice, but only the things they really need are going to justify reducing the richness and diversity. Number 4, present human interference with the non-human world is excessive, and the situation is rapidly worsening. So they're going to say humans are way too involved, having way too significant of an impact on the natural world. This is bad, and it's getting worse. The flourishing of human life and cultures is compatible with a substantial decrease of the human population. The flourishing of non-human life requires such a decrease. So here the deep ecologist is saying, we need to lower the number of humans that exist, right? We need to decrease the human population. They're not saying we should kill people, but they are saying we need to radically change the way that we think about population on Earth, that more is better. Um, and they're saying, right, if non-human life is going to flourish, we need to decrease the number of humans. Number 6, policies must therefore be changed, right? We've got to do something. These changes are going to affect basic income, technological, and ideological structures. The resulting state of affairs will be deeply different from the present. Their view is radical, right? Deep ecologists don't think, oh, we've got to make some minor tweaks here and there. They think we need to radically change the way that we're living. We can't live like this any longer. Number 7, the ideological change is mainly that of appreciating life quality rather than adhering to an increasingly higher standard of living. There will be a profound awareness of the difference between big and great. Sometimes deep ecologists say things I don't quite understand, right? So there will be a profound awareness of the difference between big and great. I don't know what that means, but I do know what this means up here, right? So the goal is to focus on quality of life rather than the standard of living, like one's wealth. So you might notice, or I don't know that you notice, right? But when we think about people in the United States over the past, few decades, the thought is we're maybe, at least the wealthy, right, are achieving higher and higher standards of living. They're making more and more money. All the while, it's not clear that their life quality is improving very dramatically, if at all. And so what the deep ecologists are saying is that we need to stop focus on making money or improving the economy. We need to focus on having a high quality of life. That's the important thing. Finally, number 8, those who subscribe to the foregoing points have an obligation, directly or indirectly, to participate in the attempt to implement the necessary changes. So this is when we talk about direct action, right? And like the sea shepherds or tree spiking, or we're going to talk maybe about protests and things like that later on. The thought is we need to do something about this. Just sort of sitting around and talking about it in our environmental ethics class is not enough. We need to actually do something to bring about these changes. Okay, so those are the 8 principles. And there's a way in which, there are 8 of them. It's a lot. I don't expect you to memorize those. But I think, for me, I found that revisiting them sort of each semester brings on like sort of a heightened appreciation of them. So at first I was like, these are sort of 8 random principles. But as I come back to them over and over again, I start to see, oh yeah, I see the sort of underlying root ideas here. And I'm increasingly sympathetic to them. All right, so those are the things that the deep ecologists are committed to. And then we want to look at the metaphysical sort of basis for these views. Why do they think those things? Why do they think that we're so off track? So, according to deep ecologists, solving our environmental problems, these sort of moral problems, are going to require us to adopt a new metaphysical view. We haven't really talked much about what metaphysics is in this class, but the idea here is that metaphysics is a sort of a picture or a study of how the world is. What's the world really like? What are humans like? What's our place in the world? And deep ecologists think we need to change our view about that. In particular, they say we need to develop an ecological consciousness on which we see every entity, human and non-human, biotic and abiotic, as fundamentally relational, that they're equally significant nodes in the interconnected fabric that constitutes reality. So here I like the image of like a spider web or something like that. So what the spider web has is a bunch of different spots along the web, and each of those spots are interconnected by these strings. And so the thought is, none of us is an island. We're connected to everything else. And once we appreciate that connection, we'll better understand our place in the world. Developing this ecological consciousness requires self-realization. That is, an awareness of oneself as deeply interconnected with other humans, non-human animals, and ecosystems, rather than as an isolated individual or ego. So I've included this picture right of that biotic pyramid we looked at last time. And the important thing to note is that we're dependent on all these other organisms in order for our survival. Again, I mentioned that there's maybe a problem of thinking about humans right at the top. For deep ecologists, I think they'd share that worry with ecocentrists. But even, we put humans down here somewhere. The thought is, it's not just that we're dependent on, but also that our well-being is connected to, and our flourishing is connected to the flourishing of these other beings. According to Arne Ness, the founder of deep ecology, we can't accomplish this self-realization, this understanding of ourself as a part of, an interconnected web, a complex whole, by accepting a line of reasoning. I can't just give you a philosophical argument for it. This is because the self-realization isn't a belief at all, right? Instead, he says it's a way of being in the world that's antithetical to Cartesian dualism, which is sort of a popular Western view that humans are thinking things that exist in our bodies. So Cartesian dualism is attributable to this guy named Descartes. He sort of dropped the day and we get Cartesian out of that. But he thought that there's mind and mental substances, and there's the physical bodies and material substances. And minds are sort of thinking, and bodies don't think at all. And what we are is just a combination of those two things. So we've got a body and we've got a mind, and the mind is sort of in the body and interacts with it. But they're very distinct things. I think growing up, I sort of found this view pretty naturally plausible. I don't know what you thought about it, but that seemed kind of right to me, the Cartesian dualist view. Maybe you're sympathetic to it, maybe you're not. But there's something intuitive about, well, they're immaterial, they're different things than what bodies are like. But the deep ecologists are going to reject that kind of view. The way to accomplish self-realization, then, is through the process of identification with nature, a situation in which identification elicits intense empathy. So we want to identify with nature, right? And to do that, we need to engage with nature in a way that motivates us to feel empathetically. And this goes back a little bit to the example I said, we should just go outside and watch worms crawl around after it's rained, and that would give us this sort of experience. But Ness gives this example in our book. My standard example has to do with a non-human being I met 40 years ago. I looked through an old-fashioned microscope at the dramatic meeting of two drops of different chemicals. A flea jumped from a lemming strolling along the table. So lemmings, I think, are these little furry rodents or whatever, and a flea must have been on one of them, and it went into this chemical solution. To save the flea was impossible. It took many minutes for the flea to die. Its movements were dreadfully expressive. What I felt was naturally a painful compassion and empathy. But the empathy was not basic. It was the process of identification. It was that I see myself in the flea. If I was alienated from the flea, not seeing intuitively anything even resembling myself, the death struggle would have left me indifferent. So there must be identification in order for there to be compassion, and among humans, solidarity. The thought here is that he saw himself in the flea, and he empathized with it, right? He appreciated the suffering that it was going through, and he sort of had that, he cared for it, right? He felt bad, as if it was another human suffering. And Ness thinks this is what we need. We need experiences like this to appreciate the natural world. So this is a question I'd like you to think about. Should we develop this kind of consciousness? And are these kinds of experiences a good way to do it, right? I've suggested, right, watching the worm crawl along the ground in a way that maybe doesn't motivate empathy in the same kind of way that watching this flea die does. But there are a lot of ways we could develop empathy. Watching videos of people suffering in famines or wars, right? The coronavirus hitting America right now. We could read stories about that or see videos of people who are experiencing that. That's a way to develop empathy. In my food ethics class last semester, I showed a video of someone shooting a cow to kill it out in a field, and the thought is like, if we're going to empathize with the animals, with the rest of nature, right, we need to watch and really see and not look away from the experiences that they go through. And I think that those experiences oftentimes help us develop this ecological consciousness. Now, sometimes they don't. Like maybe sometimes they harden us to other animals and things like that. And so I think that that's an interesting take, right? Like, what about the cases where watching these sorts of things don't promote the ecological consciousness, but they encourage us to separate ourselves from or distance ourselves from things that are unlike us? In the end, we might call the deep ecologist metaphysical picture the self and self-view. That's what Sandler calls it. This view is one on which the egoistic self, right, that thinking thing, the Cartesian-like mind, it's not really a thing. It's illusory. This idea that the egoistic self, the thing that we think we are, right, the idea that that is a mistake. It's common in Buddhist traditions and some forms of Hinduism, some indigenous peoples' worldviews. So the self and self view is common, just not as common in Western culture. And so the deep ecologists are picking up on that view from other cultures. One sort of way of thinking about the shift, right, is to think that, like, really what's important is the whole world rather than like you as a little part of it. So oftentimes we think like, I'm at the center. Me, this little being down here in Ohio, is like really important, and the world is just a thing that's made up of a bunch of little important things, whether it's people or animals or whatever. But if we think rather of the world as being the fundamental thing, and the little parts, sorry about that, and the little parts of the world as just being like interconnected pieces of this one real thing that's important, maybe that shifts our thinking and think, well, we're not really substantive things. The world is a thing. We're just more like parts of a thing. That's maybe one kind of way of getting an idea for what the self and self-view is getting at. Okay, so now we want to think about, how does deep ecology get applied to certain cases or questions? So one issue is the food system, right? On the left, we have a depiction, right, of what our food system is like these days. People who are sort of experts with using chemicals use those chemicals on fields, whether it's herbicides or pesticides, to like get the perfect concoction so that their plants will grow, and then they use these huge machines to harvest massive amounts. And the thought is like, well, maybe that's not the right system, right? Can we reform it? What would reforming it really look like? What should we do differently? This sort of image of a past better time is something that's attractive. I don't know if the deep ecologists necessarily want to go back to this, but it's worth thinking about, like, how dramatic we should change from where we're at. The deep ecologists think we should make dramatic changes, right? It's not just that we need to like make minor reforms, like, less harmful chemicals or something like that. No, we need to drastically alter what we're doing. Now you might think, One dramatic change would be something like lab-grown meat. So rather than actually using animals, we could just grow the meat in a lab. That would be a dramatic change. But that's not really the kind of change that deep ecologists would go for. Um, they think that techno fixes, right? Technology is harming us, it's making us worse. We don't need more technology. We need to go back to a simpler time. Um, we need to be smart about it, for sure. But we don't need more technology. Technology is part of the problem, not the solution. You know, we need farms that look like this. We need to engage in restorative agriculture and permaculture. We don't need more monocultures. We don't need more technology. We just need to think smarter about how we're growing food. Here's another debate, right? Monkey wrenching. So when we think about activists, environmental activists, we might think about people who are picketing or um, engaged in some sort of political action. Um, Here we've got a student specifically holding up a sign. This is all I have to do, right? And the thought is that if you really want to change the world, maybe just picketing isn't enough. Maybe it's a good step, right? But we need to go beyond just picketing. We need to actually take action and bring about change. And so you've got people like the Sea Shepherds. I think it's Paul Watson, who's sort of the captain of the Sea Shepherd. This ship in particular is named Steve Irwin, after the Animal Planet. The I don't know if I'd call it the zookeeper, but the sort of wildlife enthusiast with the famous show. Um, so the Sea Shepherd is a rams whaling ships, destroys them. It sinks them. So this ship rams into other ships, and those ships sink to the bottom of the ocean. Um, that's pretty that's pretty dramatic action, but they think it's necessary, right? The things that these whaling ships are doing is killing animals unjustly, and nobody's enforcing it. And so they've taken it upon themselves to do it. Now, this is wildly controversial, right? A lot of people think that what they're doing is wrong. It's dangerous. It could potentially kill people. I don't think they have actually killed anyone, but it very well could. And so, um, yeah, the things that they're doing um, are borderline on the kinds of things that get called eco-terrorism. And the question is, are they just activists, or are they actually terrorists? Are they doing a bad thing? Deep ecologists, I think, are going to say, um, in some cases, they're not going to like say do whatever you want, right, to bring about the change you need, but they do think dramatic change is necessary and dramatic action is appropriate in some cases. Finally, geoengineering. A lot of people think, what we need to do to solve the climate crisis? We need to just like insert some techno fix. So we need to put ocean fertilization, so increase the population of carbon absorbing plankton, something by dropping certain chemicals into the ocean, or spraying sea salt into the clouds to increase reflectivity, pumping aerosols into the atmosphere. All sorts of interesting technological solutions to our problems. But deep ecologists don't think geoengineering is the right way to go, right? Deep, deep ecologists think natural solutions are the way to go. We don't need more technology solving the problem. That's what got us here in the first place, the additional technology. Instead, we need to go back to simpler ways, simpler times, and focus on living in harmony with nature as it is. Finally, we want to address some objections to deep ecology. So one objection to deep ecology is that their value theory is problematic. So biocentric egalitarianism is false. And here we've looked at objections to biocentrism before, right? Oh, how can you eat if all living things are directly morally considerable? Now there are responses to these sorts of objections, but especially if you're going to say that all living things are equally valuable, is that view really tenable? Number two, holism is false. So here we get the same kind of objections we got to ecocentrism, right? Oh, your view entails that we should, dramatically reduce the human population. It's misanthropic or something like that. Um, Again, deep ecologists can try to respond to these objections in the same way the ecocentrists responded to those to the objection to their view. Again, that's something I'm going to leave up to you to sort of sort through and think about how strong you think those objections are. Objection number three is that people are not fundamentally relational. So it's true that we live in communities that we're interdependent, but at the end of the day, I'm not you and you're not me. When you go to the store, I don't go to the store. When you go home, I'm not going to your home, right? So we live in communities. There is some relationships that we have to each other and we affect each other, right? I think coronavirus, right, in a way is emphasizing that, right? We depend on other people not getting us sick to avoid getting sick, and we see how much we do need other people in order to live our lives. But we're not fundamentally relational on this deep level. Things can affect you without affecting me. And four, people can't identify with non-conscious living things, which is what the deep ecologist says that we're supposed to do, or with ecosystems, since there's nothing like that it's like. There's no what it's like to be a blade of grass, or a desert, or a river, or a bush, what have you. So this idea that we're gonna, a flea, right? We can sort of identify with a flea. Maybe there's a what it's like to be a flea, but there's no what it's like to be a blade of grass or to be a desert. And so we can't really put ourselves in that perspective like the deep ecologist wants us to. All right, finally for review, deep ecologists believe a few things. One, they think that all organisms are directly morally considerable. They sort of say that they're equally morally considerable. So it's a biocentric kind of view. Deep ecologists also say that collectives have value that goes over and above the value of the individuals that make them up. So it's a holist kind of view, not just the individuals are morally considerable, but collectives are morally considerable too. But their value goes above and beyond the value of the individuals. And I think this is part of the key, right? All this is true because all forms of life are fundamentally relational. So the reason that these things are true, these are things that other people say as well. But deep ecologists have a very specific reason for thinking it, that they have a metaphysical view that underlies the ethical commitments. In light of all this, right, deep ecologists think that living rightly, living well, being good people, requires developing an ecological consciousness. And the way that we develop that ecological consciousness is through self-realization. And we get that self-realization through these empathetic experiences with other beings other than ourselves. All right. So when we think about the deep ecologists, we think their focus is, in a way, not just on they value everything, right? And the question is, how are we going to balance valuing animals and valuing humans and valuing plants and valuing ecosystems? How are we going to balance all those things together? I think that's one reason why deep ecology is going to go really nicely with virtue ethics, which is the next moral theory we're going to talk about next time. All right, we'll see you then.